be on your way.
This meeting is being recorded.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon. I want to welcome everybody to, I guess this is the last block of sessions for this year's ASSA and our LERA meetings. It does feel a little different doing the last session remotely. We always joke about, actually I think even some groups have given organizations, given members some incentives, created incentives for them to stay around for that last session, but there's no reason not to do that. But anyways, my name is Bill Rodgers. This is our LERA Best Paper Session 7, Wages and Productivity. We go until 5:45. Typically, we present, the presentations go in the order of them listed, but one of our panelists is feeling under the weather and has asked if she could go first, and I think it's a reasonable, more reasonable request. So the order of presentations will be Valentine Fays. She's going to talk about Native-immigrant wage gaps in GVCs. Is it worth moving upstream? And then the discussant will be Lucombo Luveia from Howard University. Then our next paper will be Vermeylen et al. Paper, Educational and Skills Mismatches, Unraveling Their Effects on Wages Across Europe. Roy Lewis Gernhardt from Northeastern University, where my son is a rising senior, goes, business economics major. And then the third paper will be Zhang from Cornell, People's Mobility, Labor Market Disequilibrium, and Rural Development, discussed by Jason Sockin. Each presenter will have up to 25 minutes. Each discussant will have up to 10 minutes to share their thoughts, and hopefully that will leave us with around 15 minutes for exchange amongst the panel, but also most importantly, for those who are attending the session. So with that, let me turn it over to Valentine. You're on the clock.
Okay, so hello everyone. I hope that everybody hears me and sees my screen correctly. Yes. Okay, I don't know if you see this. Okay. So I'm Valentine Fahy. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Mons and at the ULB. And I am introducing you today to my second thesis dissertation that is entitled Wages Differences According to Workers' Origin, the Role of Working More Upstream in GVCs. And this paper has been co-written with Benoît, Mahy, and François. So here we are in the context of wages and wage gap according to workers' origin, and there is already an extended literature about this topic. However, in this context, there is a small but growing literature studying wage gaps according to workers' origin and global value chains. Former paper studies this relationship between different aspects of firms' globalization and wages in general, not especially about workers' origin, but wages in general. And in this matter, one particular aspect of globalization receives increasing attention, and this aspect is firms' upstreamness. Firms' upstreamness is linked to the position of firms in global value chains, and it is particularly the number of steps before firms' products meet final demand. So if a firm has a low upstreamness, it means that her products meet soon its final demand. But if firms have a higher upstreamness, then it takes a little more steps before its products meet the final demand, the final consumer. So here we are going to talk a little bit about firms' upstreamness and wages according to workers' origin. What we know, thanks to the literature, is that a higher firm's upstreamness seem to generate more added value. However, little is known on whether and to what extent the productivity gains associated with a higher firm's position in GVCs are equally shared with its workers. Former work suggests that a higher upstreamness leads to higher wages in general, but especially for men compared to women, and for highly educated workers compared to low educated workers. Upstreamness would lead also to higher within firm inequality. To our knowledge, the moderating role of workers' origin in the relationship between upstreamness and wages has not been studied so far. So this is what we are going to do. We are going to study upstreamness, workers' origin, and wages. It is very likely that upstreamness plays a role in explaining wage gaps according to workers' origin, due to first, unequal distribution of native and immigrants workers into different stages of supply chain. For example, native workers might be more up in the GVCs, while migrant workers might be more down in GVCs, so that this would lead to differences in wages. Another reason why we believe that upstreamness will lead to differences in wages according to workers' origin is that, as we saw in previous work, there might be some wage discrimination based on gender, based on education, but also based on origin. So our research question is, what is the contribution of upstreamness to wages and wage gaps according to workers' origin, and more specifically between workers born in developed countries and workers born in developing countries? What we do to study this topic is that we use matched employer-employee full cross-sectional dataset with more than 204,000 year observations, which is representative of all workers employed in manufacturing firms employing at least 10 workers over the period 2002 and 2010 in Belgium. Here in table 1, I show you means of variables of interest for all workers, for then workers born in developed countries, and then for workers born in developing countries. In workers born in developed countries, we include workers born in Belgium. We merge those two populations because there were no statistical differences between those two subpopulations regarding our variables of interest. Here in the table, we can see that the gross hourly wage for workers born in developed countries is higher than workers born in developing countries. And then the level of upstreamness in which workers born in firms where workers born in developed countries work is higher than the level of upstreamness in firms where workers born in developing countries work. In our panel, we have more than 95% of workers born in developed countries and workers born and 5%, sorry, of workers born in developing countries. With those data, we regress the gross hourly wage in a logarithm on the level of upstreamness at the firm level, controlling for a vector containing worker, job, and firm characteristics, here X. And this vector contains information about workers' education, tenure, age, gender, part-time contracts, type of employment contracts, occupation, firm-level collective agreement, number of employees in FTE, financial and economic control, and finally the region in which the firm is. Then we finally control for time zones. We will estimate this equation at the mean of the wage distribution, but also at different percentile of the wage distribution, as you will see in the next slide. So here in table 2, I show you OLS estimates, but also unconditional quantile regressions estimates for workers born in developed countries and for workers born in developing countries. First, looking at the OLS estimates, here our results suggest that the impact of upstreamness is of 2.1% on wages for workers born in developed countries. Then for workers born in developing countries, the impact of upstreamness is of 2% on wages on average. Those two estimates are not statistically different. So here our results suggest that on average, upstreamness has the same impact on wages, whether they are born in developed countries or in developing countries. What does this estimate say to us? It says that if a worker works in a firm with one step of upstreamness higher, so if the firm goes one step further in the GVC, further away from the final demand, then wages for these workers will increase in a 2% way. This is estimated at the mean, but we wanted to know if this impact was the same for both workers along the wage distribution. So we estimated the impact of upstreamness at the first quartile, the median, and the third quartile for both populations here. If we look at estimates around the first quartile, here you can see that they are quite similar. But when we move up the wage distribution, they grow apart because the impact of upstreamness grows extremely for workers born in developed countries. Here you can see that the estimators goes from 1.6% to 3.1%, moving from the first quartile to the second quartile. While for workers born in developing countries, this estimate stagnates along the wage distribution, increase a little bit at the end of it. So here our results suggest that the main winners of a higher upstreamness are top wage workers born in developed countries, and leaving behind workers born in developed countries but with low wages at the beginning, but also workers born in developing countries in the whole. Then what we wanted to know is that whether the impact of upstreamness depends on the technology used by firms. So we divided our workers according to whether they are working in high-tech and high knowledge intensity firms, or whether they work in low-tech and low knowledge intensity firms. Here there are two estimates for the impact of upstreamness on workers born in developed countries and workers born in developing countries. And this is the same here for the low-tech and low knowledge intensity firms. Our results suggest that the impact of upstreamness is the same, again, on average in high-tech and high knowledge intensity firms and in low-tech and knowledge intensity firms for both subpopulations of workers. Then, regarding the impact of upstreamness along the wage distribution, what we see in our results is that the main beneficiaries of upstreamness are, again, workers born in developed countries, because the estimates grow a lot along the wage distribution, but especially for workers born in developed countries in high-tech and knowledge intensity firms. Because compared to workers born in developing countries, here, their estimates are higher when we move up the wage distribution. If we look at the low-tech and low knowledge intensity firms, the estimates along the wage distribution stagnates a lot. So the main beneficiaries are workers working in high-tech and knowledge intensity firms, but more particularly workers born in developing countries again, and top wage ones. Then our last table here it shows us an Oaxaca blinder decomposition, first at the mean of the wage distribution and then around quartiles using an Alafortin et al. Of methodology. If we look at the mean, it is estimated that there is a wage gap of 0.1 log between our two subpopulations. And in this gap, we can define two sub-impacts of upstreamness. First, the first part is the compositional effect of upstreamness, which is the explained part of the wage gap. And then the wage structure effect of upstreamness, which is the unexplained part of upstreamness. At the mean, the explained part of the wage gap, the explained part of upstreamness of the wage gap is of 3%. It means that 3% of the wage gap between our two subpopulations are linked to differences in mean upstreamness in which workers of firms upstreamness in which workers work in. Yes. So here, for example, workers that are born in developed countries work higher up in the GVC, and that because they work higher up in the GVC explains this explains 3% of the wage gap. Then, if we look at the wage structure effect of the upstreamness, which is the unexplained part, it is estimated at 11.5% on average. And here, it is the unexplained part, which means that there are differences in wage upstreamness elasticities between our two subpopulations. And this is not explained, so this part can be linked to a certain discrimination linked with upstreamness. If we do the same as exercise, but around quartiles here, the wage gap grows and doubles even between the first quartile and the third quartile. The explained part of those wage gaps stay the same, stay constant and relatively small along the wage distribution. However, for the unexplained part of the wage gap linked with upstreamness, this is relatively consequent when looking at the first quartile, and this part grows until it attains even half of the wage gap that is linked to wage structure effect of upstreamness. So here it is rather important to take into account upstreamness to explain wage gaps between workers at the upper tail of the wage distributions. So to conclude, a higher level of upstreamness leads to higher wages for workers born in developed and developing countries in the same order of magnitude, as we saw it was of 2%. However, upstreamness returns are not equally distributed along the wage distribution. And in particular, top wage workers born in developed countries benefit the most from an increase of upstreamness, leaving behind workers born in developing countries, but also low-wage workers born in developed countries. When analyzing the wage decomposition, the explained part of the wage gap linked with upstreamness is small and constant along the wage distribution, while the unexplained part of the wage gap linked with upstreamness is more substantial and grows along the wage distribution. Our results hold when testing for endogeneity. Actually, we ran to SLS-IV regression in order to know if there were endogeneity in our model. And the result suggested that our instruments were valid, but also that we cannot reject the fact that there is no endogeneity. Then results also hold when testing for different wage definitions. We use in our benchmark gross hourly wages, but we reduce the definition of the wage by removing some bonuses and by using, for example, the basic pay. And on average, results hold. We have the same intuitions when using the base pay. Then, as we saw, results also hold when using different technology environments, as we saw in the table today, and also when using firm-level panel data. As we have a matched employer-employee dataset, we were able to collapse our dataset in order to have information about firms, and we can follow firms through time. So we were able to test for the impact of upstreamness at the firm level. And here again, results hold. If you want to, all results are available on request. And finally, these results might be explained by non-productive factors characterizing workers. For example, there might be some ethnic segregation in performance-related pay for workers. Then there might be a lower bargaining power characterizing migrant workers. That is, this idea being linked to the fact that they know less about the labor market in which they evolve. So that might be why they have a lower bargaining power. And finally, there might be also discrimination against migrant workers that has been also suggested in a previous article. Voilà, thank you for your attention. If you have comments or questions, I will be happy to answer them.
Great, Valentine, thank you. You have another 6 minutes if you'd like to maybe go into something, an issue deeper.
Okay.
Or if you want if you want to go right.
I don't know. Okay, I have a little bit more tables if you want to see them. Here, you have the results that I have obtained with the 2 SLS estimators to test for endogeneity. Here on the left, you have OLS results for workers born in developed countries was workers born in developing countries with the 2.1 and 2% that we have previously seen on another table. And here you have the 2 SLS results. These are statistically different, but they are quite close. We have an impact of upstreamness of 3.6% for workers born in developed countries and of 2.9% for workers born in developing countries. However, our endogeneity tests suggest for all specification that we cannot reject the fact that there is no endogeneity and that our results here should be preferred compared to 2 SLS ones. Up. Okay, I don't know if you see there because this is a little bit small. But here, this is results for different definitions of wages. For each first row has been already tackled in this presentation. It is the impact of the upstreamness on hourly wages, gross hourly wages. But when we move down the table, we exclude each time some bonuses, some compensation to reduce the wage definition. And when you look at the unconditional quantile estimates, you can see each time that impacts of upstreamness is growing for workers born in developed countries, while it doesn't grow and stays steady for workers born in developing countries. and each time the main beneficiaries of higher upstreamness are top wage workers born in developed countries. And I think that I will stop here, if that's okay for you.
Sure.
If you, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Should I stop the sharing?
Yes, please.
Okay, I don't know how to do that. Plus, si je fais ça, non. Ah, there. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Thank you. No worries. No worries. All right. So we'll hear from our discussants. Lucombo, Luveia.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Let me begin by congratulating Valentine for such good paper. First, it's bring an issue that is very of importance for research in economics. First, because of wage differences, which is a good topic, but more particularly wage differences in regard to upstreamness, which is something that I was not really very related to, but I learned a lot by reading her paper. One point that she just mentioned is that companies that are far away from the final, from selling to the final consumer, or are up to higher at the upstreamness, usually tend to create more value added. This is something that that is good, but also it's good to learn that even though they create a lot of value added, but is where we see more wage differences. So that is the first point, just to highlight the importance of her paper. The second, I went through the methodology, I mean the paper itself, and it followed the research methodology. On that, I have no problem. And I would like to highlight the data set. Is more than 245,000. This is very good. Almost all the work in Belgium. That is very good. And most important is that she used both in terms of individual worker, and later on, which I will explain, more aggregate data. When it's combined, it's aggregate in terms of firm level, that data set. I will also go through that as well. So I would like to talk a little bit about the first equation that she estimated using OLS and unconditional quartile regression. Just one question that I raised on that, because on the paper it said that it's a question regardless of origin of the worker. So I mean, I expect to be an equation that will estimate just all workers regardless of the origin, as it says. But it looks like that she was able to show that workers that were born in developed country and workers that were born in developing countries. So she estimated two different equations on the baseline model. The second thing is that she was able to show that those results, that those estimates are really robust, in the sense that she checked for endogeneity using 6IV. I was a little bit worried initially because I thought that 6IV were too much for just one variable, explanatory variable. But she was able to show that using testing that they were not weak and they were valid IVs, which is good. And ultimately, since the estimates were not different from the OLS regression, she was able to show that there were no endogeneity, even though further research may say otherwise. And more important, to also check for results, she was able to use more aggregate data, as I said, at the firm level, and use the fixed effect model, which I was also a little bit worried because of the possibility of heterogeneity. And she was able to use the fixed effect, and the result again were very, very, very good. So in terms of empirical methodology, I don't have much to say. It's a very strong paper because it uses many different economics technique to see that the results are robust. I just have two questions. The first is that the baseline model, in which I believe she tend to show that she tend to compare the worker, the difference in terms of wage, in terms of workers that were born from developing country and those that compared to those that were born in developed country. I'm wondering if she could just, if you could just use one model and you could use first one, regardless the origin of the worker, and the second, use a model that will just use a demi variable in which maybe 0 if the worker was born in one of the country, and 1 if he was born in the other type of the country. I mean, developed against developing country. So that is one suggestion. Then maybe we could compare with the result that you have just shown, in which you use different regression. So one regression with one demi variable against 2 different regression, using one for developed country, another for developing country. I also have one comment on the sample that was used. I saw that the period is the periods run in fall in between a period that the job market was tight. I mean, because of 2007 great recession. I'm wondering if that could in some way affect the estimate. So that is the another comment that I would like to make. So that said, that's it. And because the paper is so great, I don't have much to comment on that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We have some time allotted. You all did a great job managing your time and your comments. So Valentine, you want to respond to Lucombo?
Yeah, maybe, if I may. Thank you, Lucombo, for your wonderful comments and insights. I will look into your 2 questions now. You suggest that I use the whole data set with an interaction term between upstreamness and the fact of being born in developing countries, something like that.
Yes, correct. Yes. To compare to what you just did, yes.
Okay, actually, I have did this operation, and the interaction term is not significant. So it means that the impact of upstreamness does not differ between workers born in developed countries and workers born in developing countries also. So I have done the exercise, and it says again the same intuition using that method. And then for the time span of the data set of 2002 and 2010, you're right. It could be at some point related to the downturns that the economics and the labor market faced. And yeah, I should insert some variables to control for those variations. Even though I have already the time dummies that can help a little bit, but maybe another one couldn't hurt, and I could see if it could be interesting to insert them in the model. Thank you for your questions and comments. Thanks.
Yeah, Valentine, I have a question or two, because we still have we have a few more minutes. One is maybe on your measure of upstreamness. So you say you talk about this one step increase.
Mm-hmm.
Could you, like when we talk about this in let's say like education, so you get a college degree, that has a real concrete meaning of a person going from a high school degree to a college degree, and how much that could explain, let's say, the immigrant native wage gap. Mm-hmm. Can you give us an example of what in the concrete terms, what does one step mean, going in terms of the upstreamness? Can you make that more concrete for us?
Well, it depends on the value chain that you study, but you can, for example, think about the final step, which is where someone sells you something that they haven't made the product, but they sell you the product. Then the more you go upstream, the more smaller you go in the parts of the product, let's say. If it is a phone, you have the parts just above, which is the case of the phone. And then the more upstream you go, the more into detail you go. And then you may have the chip, you may have some other components. The more up you go to the upstream name, the more up you go in the GVC.
Gotcha.
But it really depends on the value chain, actually.
Yeah. Did you explore putting in like a quadratic term and even a cubic term, or at a minimum a quadratic, where the idea is that as you go upstream, it's not a linear relationship.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I haven't tested that, but it would be a great idea. I don't know. I don't know if it is done in the literature. I haven't. I don't think I have seen that, but maybe why not? Why not? Okay, thanks.
Well, I mean, before you do it, I mean, think through it. What's the story, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is it that when you're just starting at that, the sort of lower part of the stream, when you add more value, that could give you a bigger, right,
mm-hmm.
kick in wages, while it kind of asymptotes. It sort of increases at a decreasing rate. Or it could maybe be more initially you get, well, probably more concave. That would be my hypothesis, but
okay,
something to think about. But yeah, and then I guess the last question, because you still had a little time on your decomposition. I mean, you report to us the overall gap, and then the quantity impact because of the mean differences, and then your unobserved term.
Mm-hmm.
Is that where you're just using the upstream measure by itself?
No, I use all of the other control variables.
Okay, then I'm confused because the overall gap is 10.4%, and then you said, okay, well here's the contribution associated with the quantity differences, the mean differences in upstream, and then you have the unexplained term. Mm-hmm. But where are all the contributions of all these other variables that you listed out? Okay. Tenure, education.
Okay, so actually the first wage gap is in log, so not in percentage point, or maybe it's the same. And the other one, I just don't show them because there are too much of them. They are in my regression results, but to the purpose of this presentation, I didn't show all of them because that would have been too much to show.
Okay, or I mean, you could. I think I understand. Or I mean, you could do, here's the quantity effects of all of these other variables, Well, so here's what I guess what I would probably would explore doing.
Okay.
You have your outcome, and then you do your model where you control for all your predictors, education, experience, tenure, and see how much of that 10% is explained by all of the usual stuff.
Okay.
Right? And then stick in this upstream variable.
Okay.
Right.
To see if the impact of upstreamness is larger or smaller than the other impacts of upstreamness.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
That's the other question that people will raise. Well, how big is this? These effects. Lucombo, one question, and then we move on.
No, I'm fine. I'm fine.
Are you good? Okay.
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay. Well, Valentine, I'll be happy to talk with you more.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your comments. Thank you.
Great job. Great job. All right, let's go to our second paper. It's the Vermeylen et al. Paper, and then Roy Gernhardt will be the discussants.
Okay, so let me share. There it is. Up. Okay. So well, thank you, Bill, for the opportunity to present my paper, my joint paper. Hi everyone. Happy New Year for those I didn't see and didn't see yet. So we're gonna talk about educational and skills mismatch. Well, this is a paper we wrote with colleagues from University of Mons and with one colleague of Université Libre de Bruxelles. So I'm Guillaume Vermeylen. I'm associate professor at University of Mons. Let's go for the presentation. So as general background, we can see that the workers' level of education has globally increased over the last decades. We register 22.4% of workers that were tertiary educated in 2000. There are now more than 40%. Therefore, we can see that well, the level of education is constantly increasing in Europe. The problem is that if this increasing level of education does not match the job requirement, you have one phenomenon that is called overeducation that may appear. Well, then overeducation is the situation where the workers' attained level of education is higher than the level of education that's required for the job. This phenomenon is huge. In Europe, overeducation concerns more than 40% of workers in the Euro 28 countries over the decade to 2002 and 2016. So this is not a small business. Well, lots of empirical studies have been conducted on this phenomenon, and they constantly find the same two results. So first, overeducated workers, they suffer a wage penalty in comparison with equally educated employees that are working in jobs that match their level of education. But on the other hand, they get a wage premium in comparison with the workers working in the same jobs but possessing a level of education that match the requirements. Overeducation, on the other hand, it may not reflect the real competencies on the job, and therefore, overeducated workers may not possess the required level of skills that are needed to perform their job, and therefore overeducation does not necessarily imply overskilling. Well, there is one solution to mitigate this bias, and it consists in refining the definition of educational mismatch by making educational and skills mismatch interact. You have some studies in literature that have proposed some alternative measures in order to better take into account for heterogeneity in the workers and the jobs. But they have a common main result that the wage impact of overeducation is overestimated in these studies that assume equally educated workers to be homogeneous in their human capital endowments. Here, we do it differently and we deepen the literature insights. This paper will investigate whether interactions between overeducation and overskilling, they are able to mitigate the well-known wage penalties at European level and by relying on subjective measures of overeducation and overskilling. And then we postulate in this paper that overeducation can be either apparent or genuine, according to whether the educated workers, they are properly skilled or overskilled. Therefore, we have, let's say, four main contributions here. So first, we are able to compute the number of years of overeducation, the number of years of apparent overeducation, and the number of years of genuine overeducation, which allows us to measure the magnitude of the impact of both mismatch variables on wages. Then we take advantage of a unique European dataset, which is called the European Skills and Jobs Survey, which covers all the 28 European member states. And finally, we take into account some potential endogeneity issues in the relationships by implementing a two-stage least square estimation strategy, which has, to our knowledge, never been done before in this context and in this topic. Well, here are the wage equation models that we rely on in this paper. The first one is, let's say, it's the benchmark model, which links overeducation, the number of years of overeducation to wages. And then we go into details by making educational and skills mismatch interact with the apparent overeducation, the genuine overeducation, and their impact on the level of wages of the workers. We also control for lots of variables, such as the length of studies, basically the attained level of education of the worker, gender, age, tenure, type of contract, if they work part-time or not, the size of the firm, the sector of activity, what else? The country in which the firm is established, and so on. So that's the kind of regression we are running here. In terms of estimation techniques, we first start with the pooled OLS, such as has a benchmark, and then we have the 2 SLS estimator with key instruments, and we used the willingness to work close to home, the preference for leisures, and the preference for self-learning, which can explain the mismatch situation of the worker without having an impact on wages as such. So these 3 variables are our IVs in this estimation strategy. Concerning the data, so as I said a couple of slides ago, we rely on the European Skills and Job Survey dataset, which is a 2014 dataset covering more than 48,000 employees that are aged between 24 and 65. They are coming from the 28 European member states. And then after some restrictions, we have a final sample of 23,123 exploitable observations. So this is the sample size of the paper. Well, let's jump into the main results. Well, I suggest you to focus on the 2 SLS estimator. So first, the benchmark model, which links overeducation, years of overeducation to wages. We can see that increasing the level of overeducation by 1 year in the firm has an impact of 18.1% on the gross monthly wages, and which is quite linked with existing literature. But the most interesting part of these results is the second and third variable, which are apparent overeducation and genuine overeducation. And we can see that increasing the level of apparent overeducation by 1 year has a 6.9% impact on wages. So you suffer a wage penalty of 6.9% if you are increasing your level of apparent overeducation by 1 year. But if you are increasing the level of genuine overeducation by 1 year, you have a higher wage penalty, which is estimated at 17.9% per year of genuine over-education. So when you mix both over-education and over-skilling. We run also a couple of tests, such as under-identification tests, weak identification tests, and homogeneity test, and our estimations and our data, they pass through the test, so we can validate our instruments and our estimation strategy on both educational mismatch and interaction variables. So, well, let's jump to the conclusion. So we rely on the first pan-European survey on skills mismatch, and this paper investigated the wage effects of new and more precise measure of mismatch. The current investigations, they rely on educational background of workers only, but these papers challenges education by interacting over education and over skilling in two specific situations, which are apparent over education, where you are educated but you are properly skilled, and genuine over education, where you are both over educated and over skilled. We also deepen the analysis by computing the magnitude of the wage effects of mismatches in terms of additional years of education, of apparent over education and genuine over education. And finally, we are among the first to our knowledge to test for the existence of endogeneity associated to education and skills mismatch variables, such as thanks to our 2SLS models. The best estimates we get show that over-educated workers, they earn less than their colleagues in jobs that match their level of education. This penalty is found to vary a lot on whether over-education is linked to over-skilling. And then 1 year of over-education among workers that are properly skilled, so apparent over-educated, it leads to a wage penalty of 6.9%. Then the penalty for genuine over-education is more than doubled, nearly 18% wage penalty per year of genuine over-education. And then these estimates that are robust to endogeneity, they are of concern for lots of respects. So first, the descriptive statistics, they show that genuinely over-educated workers, they represent a large group of workers, of mismatch workers in the European Union. It's basically more than 20% of workers that are found to be genuinely over-educated. And then obviously this is quite costly for workers' perspective. But the cost of mismatch is also likely to be quite huge for the economy as a whole. And recent papers, they show that over-educated or over-skilled workers, they could create more value added if they were doing a job that matched their educational level. And therefore, in this paper, our estimate, they suggest that a better allocation of the resources in the economy, it could improve the overall productivity significantly, and improving the quality of job worker matches in Europe. And it does appear to be a key challenge, not only for the workers, for workers' perspective, but also for the economy as a whole. Well, that's all for this quick presentation of this first paper on both skills and education. Well, I thank you for your attention, and I'm ready to answer your questions. Sorry, I didn't hear you, Bill.
I was muted. Sorry about that.
Okay.
You have about 13 minutes left, so if you'd like to go into something a little more in depth before we hear from Professor Gernhardt, please.
Okay. Well, we went deeper in the analysis in the second stand. So that's the first step of the paper. Then we tried what we are trying right here. Well, to mix what Valentine did in the previous presentation, and we tried to mix the immigration status of the workers but we didn't get any significant results at this stage. But it could be interesting to check whether there are differences between the mismatch situation in terms of education and in terms of skills once we focus on the immigration status of the workers. Basically, we are barely convinced that overskilling can have higher impacts if you are born in another country than the one in which you are working. But we didn't get any robust results as such for the moment, but we are still working on it. So we are open for some suggestions and some tips for the next step.
Sounds good.
But that's pretty all for this first draft.
Sounds good. Thank you so much. Why don't we go to Roy Gernhardt from Northeastern?
Absolutely. Thank you. Guillaume, I want to say thank you very much for your presentation and for your paper. This is a great paper, very interesting topic. I've very much enjoyed looking at it and digging into it. And Bill, thank you for the promotion to being professor. I am just a PhD candidate at Northeastern. I'm a non-traditional student, so I don't look at
I have perfect foresight.
Exactly. There you go. There you go. I thank you. Thank you very much. So I guess I should share my screen. Let me pull this up here. Okay, and we'll go from the beginning. And good. Okay, so as you saw, the title of this paper is Educational and Skills Mismatch. They're unraveling their effects on wages across Europe. Let me walk you through a quick overview from my perspective as I was reading along. There are two really well-established effects of overeducation in the literature, as Guillaume mentioned. First is the wage penalty, where we're going to compare similarly educated but properly placed peers. So in the US, we have a kind of a figure of speech that we use where we call this the English major who's working at McDonald's. So somebody who's just clearly overeducated. But the problem is, of course, bigger than just if somebody has is overeducated and isn't able to get placed in their field. The problem also may be that there's, and as a matter of fact, I think there's pretty clear evidence in the literature that there's inflation. So 20 years ago, a job that you could have gotten with a high school degree, and that was enough, would not be able to get you the same job today. So it's a very important issue. The second effect that shows up in the literature is the wage premium when you're comparing similarly placed but less educated peers. One mechanism that I would float as possibility here is bargaining advantages that are going to accrue to the higher educated individual. They're, of course, going to have more outside options. They're going to possibly be better skilled in the process of the job search. So it's a big deal in both cases. And what the authors here are really concerned about are these informal skills, which could be critical to perform a certain job, but they're harder to measure, and they're not necessarily related to formal schooling. And I think their instinct would be to say that informal skills may very well be even more important, have a bigger impact. And they're aiming to parse the effects of overeducation and overskilling in order to understand better the impact of both of them on wages. So the data they're going to use is the 2014 European Skills and Jobs Survey. And what they're going to have here is categorical variables that are going to have 6 values. So these are binned, and this is pretty normal. You can see how the bins work. You've got 6 years of education completed, 9 years, then 12, 14, 16, and 17. And there are 3 pertinent questions in the survey that they're going to use to construct their variables of interest. The first one is, what's the highest level of education that the survey respondent has completed? And so because I'm going to come back to this, I'm going to give this the variable A for attained And then the second question is, what's the level of education or training that's needed to get the job? So here I'm going to give this the variable G for get. And then the third question is, what's the level of education or training you need to do your job? And here I'm going to give this the variable D for do. So the first thing they're going to do is a controlled single OLS regression of log wages on overeducation. And they're going to define that as A minus G. So that's education attained minus the education required to get the job. And then they specify that they're going to choose that, they're going to set that at 0 if G is greater than A. This is an interesting point that I'm going to hang on for a second to, because it's going to become useful on us in a minute. If the data were perfect, and it's not, we live in a world where data is never perfect, right? But if the data were perfect, this would never happen for definitional reasons, because that is, if you have a job, but you don't meet the requirements to have that job, then they weren't actually requirements. Now, it's possible, again, I'm sure that the ESJS is not written in English, so there may be some translational stuff happening here, but it's still one of those things that shouldn't happen a whole lot. So this choice to set the overeducation at 0 when G is greater than A, I think is certainly a valid choice. But it does it does raise bells to say, okay, when that's happening, there's probably some kind of measurement error. Okay. And then they're going to do a controlled multiple OLS regression of log wages on apparent overeducation and on genuine overeducation, which they're going to calculate. And then they're going to do 2 SLS versions of both regressions to control for unobserved variables. So looking at the results, their single OLS regression shows that each year of education results in a 6.9% wage penalty compared to properly matched peers. This extends the existing literature nicely, fits right in the results that we expected to see, and is great. Now I want to move on to some suggestions here. This paper is a work in process, and it's a fantastic work in progress. I'm excited to have a chance to give some feedback at this critical point. I want to bring up a couple of topics. The first one is the construction of the variables of interest in the multiple OLS, and then the second one is the use of 2 SLS. So first, let's look at the genuine overeducation. So this is defined as A minus G, that is the attained education minus the education required to get the job. They're going to multiply that by an indicator, if I'm understanding correctly, that is going to be equal to 1 if the attained education is greater than that which is required to do the job. And this ends up being about 23.6% of their sample. And then apparent overeducation is going to be defined as that same figure, A minus G, times the indicator that's going to take a value of 1 if A is equal to D. So if the attained education is equal to the education is required to do the job. Now, since we've already established that A is going to be greater than or equal to G, we're going to set it to 0 if it's not. Then this means that for there to be overeducation, apparent overeducation, then D has to be greater than G, or the education required to do the job has to be greater than the education required to get the job. And if you think about that just as a story, you realize that that means that the employer has to have hired an unqualified worker and has to have had enough information to know that. Now, I mean, it could be that we have employers that are inexperienced, but they would quickly learn that isn't working out. And so it seems only plausible that this is going to happen during major labor shortages, and it should be a rare occurrence. Sure enough, it is rare. It shows up only 2.5% of the sample. But that really kind of gets to the main point, and that is that this is small enough amount of the sample that this really could be driven by measurement error. So one suggestion that you might be able to do to even just as a robustness check is maybe try aggregating across all workers in an occupation. in order to increase that accuracy. So what we're going to try to do here is average out those errors. So that might work, as you're, continuing to work on this. Now, the other thing I want to look at are the instrumental variables. As Guillaume mentioned, there are 3 of them. One is willingness to work close to home. The other one is preference for leisure. And the third is preference for self-learning. I'm assuming that these are questions in the ESJS survey. Based simply on that description, though, I have concerns about the exclusion restriction with all 3 of them. So, for instance, if we're looking at willingness to work close to home, that could be correlated with wages, because a worker who's unwilling to travel would be drawing on a necessarily smaller pool of potential employers, therefore resulting in lower bargaining power and lower wages. The authors do attempt to address this by looking at the bivariate correlations between the instruments and the log wages, but I don't find that test convincing. So there's that. But so I want to say thank you. Again, I think it's a fantastic paper, fantastic work in progress. I really enjoyed it. It's a great topic. It's a very important topic. I want to thank Lera. I want to thank Emily Smith for her wonderful work. And Bill, your moderating skills, I can already tell, are fantastic, and I love it. So there you go. There are my comments. I hope they're helpful. And I'll certainly, if you'd like, I'll certainly email you my slides.
Roy, thank you very much. Thank you. Guillaume, you want to respond to Roy? We have some time.
Yeah. Yes. Of course. Well, thank you very much for your intervention and your suggestions and your reading. Thank you. That was great. Nothing that much to say. Maybe a few words about your 2 main concerns. The first one is the construction of variables. I do agree that the variable D, the fact that the level of education you need to do the job, the fact that it's greater than G, it's not you are not buying it. I have an example, maybe not necessarily. I have an example that could explain this situation. Just imagine that the requirements for a job are written on job advertisements, for example, and they have not evolved compared to the real requirements of the job. Then you can end up in a situation where D is higher than G. And it happens a lot in Belgium, for example, where we reprint the requirements for a job, and the job is evolving on this side, but they are not stitching with the requirements that are launched to the job seekers, and then you can end up in this kind of situation. But I totally agree with you that that's a really small part of the business, and we have to be careful to that, since, as you mentioned, that's a small part of our data. Only 2, maybe nearly 3% of the workers end up in this situation. But that's the way the data is constructed. The database is constructed also, and that's the way we did and how we can rely on the data and on our measurements of these variables. But what we have to work on it. So thank you for this remark. I keep that in mind, and we have to work on it. Concerning the instrumentations of the 2 SLS and the instrument, the IVs we have chosen, I was waiting for this kind of suggestions. The correlation are not that much convincing. I agree with that. On top of that, we made lots of tests, of validation tests in the paper that they validate the IVs we are using. The major point here is that we have to find variables that are correlated with the educational and the mismatch variables and that are not with the wages. And this is very complicated. But as you mentioned, some variables, they can be correlated. The example you take is that the IVs are correlated with a given situation of the worker. For example, the fact that they are losing power in their bargaining situation, and at the end you have in the second range, in the second step, you have an impact on wages. Basically and statistically speaking, this means that the variable, the mismatch variable, is correlated with the bargaining power, not that much on wages. That's the bargaining power that is correlated with wages. So you have a second range correlation, not the first range. And that's why we have chosen these kind of variables. But I do agree, and I totally agree that that's really hard to find variables, IVs, that are not correlated with wages and that are correlated with education, since, well, educational variables, they are the key for being hired for a job, and that's compulsory. There is a link with the wages you are able to get when you are hired in a job. Well, at the end, I agree. We have to find variables in the literature and in the database that are not correlated at all with wages. But really hard business. But thank you very much for your reading and for your slides. This was great. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I have lots of questions too, but in the interest of time, just making sure that Zhang and Jason Sockin have enough time, and we have time for general conversation. We'll go right to the next paper. Zhang is going to talk about people's mobility, labor market disequilibrium, and rural development.
Thank you, Bill. So can everyone see my screen? Hello?
Still not. I'm not seeing it.
No.
I see a thing that says that you started screen sharing, but nothing else.
Oh, sorry, let me.
Well, it says you are viewing your screen, but it's all black. There you go. Now you're good.
Can people hear me? Can people see my screen? I think the internet connection is not that stable here.
Well, I hear you, and I see.
Okay,
your,
great. Finally, thank you so much for your patience. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad there's still people to hang around to listen to my presentation on people's mobility, labor market, disequilibrium, and rural development. So as we can see in this graph, the domestic migration in the US is decreased in the recent years, and the migration is measured by the inter-county migration. However, on the other side, as we can see, the inter-county commuting is increasing along with the travel time. So as we can see, substitution between migration and commuting, which lead also as rural development, as we can see that the rural areas are losing people, especially the young age, as it's called brain drain in rural development literature. And if we look close to the table, as we can see that in rural communities, there is more people choose to out commute rather than out migrants. And we can see the switch because long time ago, it's more about the rural community are losing people, but we can see in the rural people, it may even gain people to migrate to rural communities. For example, during COVID-19, because there's a lot of cases in city center, a lot of people actually choose to move to rural areas because they may like the beautiful natural scene in rural communities. So my research question is how to build a general framework to explain both commuting and migration as two important parts of the people's mobility. And what are the implications of this mobility framework for rural community development? So in this research, I bring theories from 3 different kinds of theories. The first one is the mobility paradigm. In the mobility theory, it more focused on the individual level to link people's mobility with the place. And for the location theory, it's more focused on the migration, but it's always underestimate the role of commuting, especially the long distance commuting. And for the economic theory, it focused on the labor supply and demand, but sometimes it may underestimate the connections between places. So in this research, I built a general spatial disequilibrium framework, which fill the gaps of the mobility paradigm by linking people with place. Also fill the gaps of location theory by not only consider commuting, but also consider migration. Also can kind of fill the gaps of economic theory by linking the place. So that is my theoretical framework. From the empirical study in this research, I analyzed the county-to-county commuting and migration in the US. And for the mobility paradigm, I'm going to look at the residential mobility, which include labor market, housing market, and amenity market, to analyze which factors related to the number of out commuters and number of out migrants. And for the locational theory, a lot of locational theory focus on the urban area, but my research going to build the connection between rural and urban, and it will link the development of rural and urban. And for the economic theory, this framework will link the differences between place, which in this research, I consider the differences between labor market, housing market, and amenity market between different counties in the US. So the unit of analysis in this study is county pair. I got the data from the journey to work and the county-to-county migration data set, which includes the number of out commuters from one county to another county. It also includes the number of out migrants from one county to another county. By using this data set, it allows me to analyze not only the labor market, housing market, and amenity market in one county. I can also link the attributes of different markets to another country. So it will allow me to consider the local labor market balance, the labor market differences between two counties, along with the spatial disequilibrium in housing market and amenity market. So in this research, I created this general spatial disequilibrium framework to analyze what factors in the residential or origin county and what factors in the workplace, the destination county, can relate it to the number of out commuters and out migrants between two counties. So first part of this spatial disequilibrium framework is to consider the local labor market mismatch. So what's the differences between the supply and demand in local labor market can relate it to the number of out commuter and out migrants. For example, if the labor supply is more than labor demand, it could push people to move out. On the other hand, if the labor supply is less than labor demand, it can pull people to move in. I did the same for the workplace or the destination county for the migrants. On the other side, I consider spatial disequilibrium between two places. The first part is the labor market balance differences, because for each labor market, it has a local labor market mismatch. But because the unit of analysis is county pair, it allows me to consider the balances of two places. By using this information, I can able to analyze the gap between the two counties. So the second part of this spatial disequilibrium is to analyze the spatial disequilibrium in labor market, housing market, and amenity market. So for the local labor market disequilibrium, I measure two types of the disequilibrium. The first is like the last presenter is the skill mismatch. I analyze the differences between education and occupation. For two scenarios, one is overeducated, another one is undereducated. So it will lead to a local skill mismatch. Then it may be related to a number of out migrants or number of out commuter. It could be positive related to the outflow, which shows that it may looking for outside job opportunities. Or if it's negatively related to people's mobility, it may imply that there's more local job opportunity. And the second local market mismatch is measured by the difference. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention. Because using the county pair, I'm able to compare the local labor market mismatch between two places. So I create a dummy variable to measure the spatial disequilibrium. If it's equal to 1, which means the people are more satisfied with job in the workplace, it shows that the local labor market mismatch in the original place could be greater than the local labor market mismatch in the receiving place. And in this education occupation disequilibrium, I separate it into two groups. The first one is the mismatch in the high education group. Education measure bachelor or more, and high skill, which include management and professional occupation. And the second group is the match between low education and low skill. This part measures the differences within the local labor market. And for the second part, I measure the spatial disequilibrium. I compare the local labor market mismatch between the sending place where people move out and the receiving place where people move in. And the second pair to measure for the local labor market mismatch is the residential firm employment disequilibrium. In this part, I measure the differences between labor supply and labor demand to measure the labor surplus or deficit. And by using this method, it implies the labor competitiveness. And if it's related to a positive, people's move out, it could show that the local labor is less competitive. They are being pushed out. And if it's negative, it could imply that local labor is more competitive. By using the same method, I create a measure to measure the spatial disequilibrium for this pair. And if it's equal to 1, it implies that the firms employs more local labor in the workplace. It also shows that the local labor market mismatch in the sending place is higher than the receiving place. And in this pair, like the high skill and the low skill, I measure the service sector and the professional related sector. For other spatial disequilibrium measures, I include other measures in the labor market, which include the pull factors, which factors attract people to move in. As we can expect it includes the wage differences between two places. It also includes the labor participation. And for the push factors, which push people to move out of the county, I include the unemployment rate and self-employment rate. And other factors is high education, because it could be a factor to attract people to move in, but it also could be a factor push people to move out, because we know people with high educational level are more likely to move. And for the housing market, I measure the percent of home ownership. I also include measure for the amenity cost. And to connect two places, I measure the travel distance. So to measure the spatial disequilibrium framework and using the county pair as my unit of analysis, I use group logic model. And the dependent variable is the number of out commuters and out migrants. And the independent variables include the local labor market mismatch, which include these two pairs. The first one is education occupation pair, and the second one is residence and firm pair. And for the second part of this framework, I include variables to measure the regional market differences, which include the spatial disequilibrium corresponds to the local labor market mismatch pairs. And also include the push factors, and other factors to include more control factors to measure the labor spatial disequilibrium in labor market. And for housing market and amenity market, I just create the housing ownership and amenity cost as a proxy to measure the spatial disequilibrium in the housing market and amenity market. So I will briefly show the model result. As we can see in this table, it shows that the local labor market skill mismatch is not related to the out commuter from non-metro counties. It's more related to the out commuter and out migrants for metro counties. It implies that, in general, people living in metro counties could be more mobile than people live in non-metro counties. As we can also see that for the high skill, in both for the high skill mismatch, which means people living in metro counties, if there's a high skill mismatch, it's going to push people to commute or migrate to another county to look for more job opportunities. And for the low skill, if it's from the metro county, you can see it stuck in the metro county. And for the job competitiveness, we can see that the same result, people live in metro counties are more mobile than people live in non-metro counties. And for the regional labor market mismatch, we can see that the regional differences in the local labor market is related to people's commute and migrate. And a greater spatial disequilibrium going to push people to commute or migrate. And for the other factors, for the pull factor, as we expected, places with higher wages are more likely to attract people to move in. Also, as a better labor market, which could be measured as the percent of labor participation, those communities also attract people to commute or migrate for more job opportunities. As self-employment, it could be a measure to the entrepreneurship. It could keep people to stay in the county because you can see it negatively related to both the number of in-commuters and the number of immigrants. So what about other factors? we can see the living expense. The higher living expense in metro areas going to push people to move out, but it shows a different scenario for non-metro areas. Non-metro areas with a higher living expense can actually attract people to move in, because the living expense could be a measure of quality of life. Non-metro counties with a better quality of life could attract urban immigrants. As other measures, including the natural amenity, is attract urban immigrants to move in, is confirm some rural development strategies, including the amenity-led development. Housing ownership also show an opposite result for metro and non-metro counties. A higher housing ownership in metro counties could actually push people to move out, which I think could be related that people have a housing could sell their house and find a better place in non-metro areas. But for non-metro areas, people with a high ownership actually going to keep people in non-metro counties. So what this result shows, it shows that the spatial disequilibrium framework can explain both commuting and migration, as it could explain the increasing substitution between commuting and migration. More people choose to commute rather than migrate. It can also show that people commute and migrate to places with higher wages. It confirms the new economic geography theory. And by separating the local labor market mismatch into different skills, it shows that high-skilled labor are more likely to commute or migrate. They in general have more choices. Compared to high-skilled labor, the low-skilled labor stuck in metro counties. So for the implication for rural development, it shows that the new endogenous rural development is the key. It is important to decrease the local market disequilibrium to help local residents to find a job which can help to return and increase population in rural communities. This model also shows the importance of promote countryside consumption. As probably forgot to mention, the embeddedness of service sector in local labor market could attract people. It also shows that non-metro counties with a better natural amenity could attract urban immigrants. This result also shows the connection between rural and urban are important, and the embeddedness of professional sector could attract urban migrants. So there's three main conclusions for this paper. The first one is the spatial disequilibrium framework can explain the commuting and migration. It shows both pull and push factors inter-county and the labor market disequilibrium inside the county are important factors to explain people's mobility. And one of the contributions of the spatial disequilibrium framework is to link the two places. It shows that the development is the interaction between space, and local government should comprehensively consider the disequilibrium inside the community as well as the connection with other communities. It's especially important for rural development. It needs to think the relation between the surrounding urban areas. So for the regional development, should consider the balance between labor market, housing market, and amenity market. And this research considers the local labor market mismatch. It shows the importance of balancing the education and job creation, which can help rural areas to return and increase population. It also shows that it's need to consider the balance between amenity market and housing market.
Great. So Zhang, thank you so much. That was a great presentation, and that reflects a really high good quality paper. Why don't we go to Jason, who will share some thoughts.
So it says I don't have the ability to share my screen. Given that. It says host disabled, so I don't know.
I believe
Let's
we
see if
have
we can fix that.
our tech support could make you, I think, a co-host where you could then share.
Guess we are facing some technical issues.
Yeah. I don't know if anyone is there that can help. I currently don't have the ability to share my screen. It says host disabled. So either if someone can provide that, I can always, I guess, start without my slides, but
yeah, we have a tech support person I see is in the session, but hopefully they're hearing us. They could potentially shift you, because I think they have to make you a co-host.
Yes, I'm doing that right now.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Jason, you are good to go.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, thanks again.
Can everyone see my screen now? I can share it. Perfect. So thank you for inviting me to present and discuss this paper. I always enjoy reading a paper, especially a labor paper. Pretty much any labor paper I'll enjoy, but especially one that makes me think about sort of my own life and how think about problems that really face today's society. And I feel like this is kind of trying to address some important issues. And so I'm going to start with some top line, larger picture issues, then get into some minor details towards the end. But what I really enjoy about this paper is it's trying to introduce this kind of new framework, right? And I summarize it by the simple question of, should I stay or should I go, right? One's mobility decision is not just a function of where they are now, but it's really the place you may wish to go, right? So it's not just about potential disequilibrium or some factors that are in your current state, your county or metro, wherever you may be, but also where you might be targeting or going to. And so the author sort of frames this as two potential factors. One is sort of mismatch within the place you currently are. Then there's also this potential regional disequilibrium, which is sort of this composite factor, if you will, taking into account all the different aspects of life that you might have in these places that you travel or that you move to. So it could be the labor market in terms of employment and wages. It could be the housing market in terms of housing prices and sort of cost of living. Then also in terms of the amenity market, this idea of how nice it is to live somewhere. And so all of these different factors can really just affect whether someone wants to move somewhere or live somewhere else. And I think about this as it could also be related to other aspects of moving. This is sort of a framework that doesn't have to exist just within places, right? If I'm trying to determine whether I want to switch firms or switch where I'm working, I might also do a very similar thing. Thinking about the situation I have now in terms of mismatch, you can think about in terms of overskilling we talked about in earlier papers, but also, right, is there a wage mismatch? Is there amenity mismatch between where I am now and where I could be going? These other options available. So I think this is actually a framework that can go beyond just in terms of regions, but I do think there's something very important here about, it's not just about where you are, but about all the options that you have in terms of where you might go. And you have to consider differences between places, not just differences where you are now. So I really, really like this idea of this framework being sort of robust and can be utilized in different frames. That said, I try to think about, is pairwise really the right perspective? So the author says that one of the novel introductions is this idea of looking at county by county pairs. But when I think about mobility, I don't know if pairwise is the way I think about mobility. I might think about it as a story of donuts rather than a story of pairs. And I just take my own sort of upbringing. So I'm from the suburbs of New York City. And so New York City has Long Island to the east, it has Westchester to the north, it has Rockland County to the northwest, it has Hoboken and Jersey City to the southwest. So you have all these different areas around New York City, not just one county that you might be choosing. So if I'm deciding where I want to commute to or where I want to migrate to, I may not just be considering New York City and Long Island or New York City and Westchester. I'm really taking into account the entire donut around New York City. So also these spillovers and these regional neighbors might matter a lot. So are commuting and migrating decisions within this donut, are they related to the characteristics of all neighborhoods, not just pairwise? So thinking about what's maybe my best option available to, like maybe like a max wage, or what's your max cost of living, or minimum cost of living, your adjacent labor mismatch. So where is there jobs available versus maybe jobs not so much available? So thinking about this as a holistic, maybe metropolitan area with its neighboring counties, not just a pairwise decision between two. And then one thing that I really enjoy is this sort of incorporation, this really interesting, or I think even novel amenity data, right? This amenity value that's going to be introduced in the paper is going to be capturing natural amenity value from the US Department of Agriculture. And the way they describe this amenity value is a measure of the physical characteristics of a county area that enhance the location as a place to live. So characteristics like warm winter, winter sun, temperate summer, low summer humidity, topographic variation, and water area are the factors that go into it. And I've taken this map from the USDA website. And what we could see is that one thing that struck me as important or unique about this measure is it's not just urban versus rural. My ex-ante expectation was that this would be sort of an urban-rural kind of divide, where you sort of see that urban maybe has worse air quality, and so maybe there's differences in there. But we really do see there are differences across the US, not just capturing urban and rural. We've seen that the higher levels of this amenity value really capture maybe in the West and in the Southern United States, whereas sort of in the central part of the US is where we actually lower amenity scales. There are differences or variation in the scale. That's not just urban versus rural. So I found that kind of important for this analysis. However, I wasn't sure if that was really capturing all of the amenities in the sense of what amenities might matter for differences in amenity value between two places, right? In the sense that urban amenities are going to be missing from this measure of amenities, because this amenity scale is specifically only natural amenities. So there's a couple of papers, and I put them in the subheading here, talking about the importance of urban amenities for people's migration towards metro areas and urban centers. And these can have the ability to actually attract workers or migrants to metro areas, such as improved transportation, education, arts and theater, better healthcare, recreational sites, so like specifically public recreational areas and public parks. Maybe local businesses like restaurant quality, maybe better in metro areas than non-metro areas. And then also social networks, right? The ability to meet for dating and marriage markets. So I think there are a lot of amenities to metro areas that I think this paper frames it as, oh, amenities are better once you leave the metro because you get these natural amenities, but there's also these urban amenities that are sort of countervailing those natural amenities. So I think a discussion of amenity market has to make sure to sort of balance these two things. And again, one of the reasons I kind of like this paper is it made me think about my own sort of preferences for amenities, because I like traveling to national parks, but I also like having my urban amenities available to me. So I think making sure to balance those two different types of amenities in this amenity market. And then in terms of trying to capture amenities, I think the author goes so far as to include the average wage to capture some sort of compensating differential, is that you might trade off amenity value for better wages. However, if you look sort of in the literature on this compensating differential for urban amenities, it seems to be only about 26 to 49%. So it's not fully compensated. So yes, the average wage does pick up partially this compensating differential, this differences in amenities, but not fully. So I do think there's something missing from not trying to incorporate these urban amenities into the analysis as well. And then I think my third major point is who is being captured in this analysis, right? So Marinescu and Rathlaw 2018 sort of show, they look at this idea of how much geographic mismatch is there, or are we missing from looking at online data? And what they do is they look at the share of people's job applications, right, by their distance or basically from their current area to outside areas. So they look at what the share of applications are within state, within core-based statistical area, within a county, within a zip code. And what they find is that most people don't want to go very far, right? 89% of applications are within state, 81% of job seekers' applications are within core-based statistical area. And this is for people who are searching online. So you might even think that the percentage is even higher for those that aren't searching online and only looking within sort of local job opportunities. So the question there is, who's really the marginal worker who's commuting across counties, who's commuting across states, or who's migrating across counties or across states? Since most workers would prefer to stay local or close, and there's sort of this disamenity towards traveling very far. So when we think about this idea of modeling the decision, who is that marginal person who's being affected by the decision. I think trying to think more about, are these people that are really the most mismatched, and they can't get a job where they want to, so they have to accept a lower preference job, and thus maybe their lower productivity, things like that. So trying to think about who are the people that might be migrating across counties and across states. And then one of my other larger points, I think this idea of, can we study both commuting and migrating in this framework? I know the author tries to make statements about both commuting and migrating, but in looking at the commuting sample, the author imposes a sample restriction, I think inherently reflecting the trade-off between the two, right? This paper uses 100 miles as a distance filter and deletes the commuting county pairs with more than 100 miles of travel distance. All the migration county pairs are included because migration distance can be more flexible. And I agree with that. I think that's right. I think people aren't going to be willing to commute that much farther maybe than 100 miles. But I think that says something about commuting rather than as a sample restriction, right? In the sense that commuting is going to be inherently limited by time constraints. So I think we should use true zeros when trying to think about how people commute across county pairs if they're not going to be commuting more than 100 miles, in the sense that it shows us there's a really extreme punishment to commuting too far. And so I think rather than throwing those out, I think using those as sort of measures of how important is this trade-off between distance and all these other factors. And so on top of that, is this more should be the focus that we think about the decision to commute or migrate between counties that are 100 miles each other, right? So taking the fact that people are only willing to commute at most maybe 100 miles, right? Do we want to think about why does someone choose to commute to a county rather than actually just migrate and move there, right? Because I think you can directly answer that just by sample restriction on your migration to those county pairs of commuting. So I think that gets at a really inframarginal important question, right? Is why would I move a place, or should I move to that county, or should I just keep commuting to that county? And so I think you can say something very important there about the marginal decision there, whereas commuting or comparing commuting pairs that are close, but then migrating pairs that are very far apart, I think it's already, you're kind of comparing them in different samples. And I think I'm almost out of time. So the last thing I'll say is, I know as sort of in the conclusions, we say that a lot of these things matter, but I was left wanting this decision of, can we speak to which one matters more potentially, right? Is it more about where I am, more about where I'm going to be going, right? The frictions between the two or the friction where I am, right? So in these empirical takeaways, there's sort of many, many measures of regional disequilibrium and labor mismatch. I think it's great how robust the data is. And there's kind of some theory included for why we might include home ownership or entrepreneurialism. But at the end of the day, like a lot are significant, others not. And it's not clear how quantitatively meaningful a coefficient is relative to the other. So trying to get some sense of which one matters the most, I think would be helpful for sort of a summary takeaway. And then just some last things in the sense of, I think you can get county level data from the census on demographics. So it'd be nice to control for different demographic characteristics. So I think that can help control for some of the things about, potential dating markets or retirement, things like that, why people might move to different counties. But otherwise, I really enjoyed it, and I hope these comments are helpful.
Yeah, Jason, thank you for those comments. They're very thoughtful. And that little technical glitch we just had, that had nothing to do with that. Before we open it up to the full body of folks here, I see some good longtime friends are in the audience. Sho, do you want to respond or share some thoughts to Jason?
Yes, first, thank you so much for your very thoughtful comments. I really liked it. And I have some comments on your second point about the amenity market. I have a paper built on this paper, but you discuss a more broader amenity market. I actually got the data from the AARP livability indicator. It has amenity including transportation, health, neighborhood, and civic engagement. And another paper found that, yes, you are right. For the urban places, it's the neighborhood, transportation, and health matters very important. But for the rural area, it's the social engagement and housing market matters more than urban area. And I also like I really like your point about the donut. I think maybe in the model I can have a dummy variable to measure the labor market area to kind of capture which counties could be grouped together as one labor market area in the model. And also like your idea about maybe you can create dummy variable to show if the travel distance is beyond 100 miles to capture long distance commuting.
Great, thank you. If you have a question, we're small enough where you can either send your question into the chat and I'll recognize you, or you can raise your hand. To be happy to entertain any questions from the group. While we're waiting, I have a comment on Guillaume, your paper. What might be interesting to do is if you think that this overeducation phenomena is targeted or is more likely to show up in certain groups, estimate your models for those subgroups if you have enough samples. So, for example, young people, right? Young people who are just starting their career, that they may have who've gotten college degrees, right? And as I believe Roy even used that example, a similar example. That do you see these people? Do you see a larger penalty to mismatch? And then the other group would be related to our papers here are immigrants. Right? I think that's the example he used, but people coming to a particular country and not having or having more education than is needed, or then there is this sort of discounting, right, that goes on. Some countries or some countries' economies don't fully sort of appreciate a college degree from a foreign country. So that'd be interesting to think through that. And then my last comment is these are point in time estimates, right? In terms of your mismatch, these are due to having more education. How long do they last, right? I mean, that would necessitate moving to some longitudinal type data where you could follow people and looking at job switchers and see if things do get cleared up. But the one thing that, as I'm thinking about these papers, that really ties them together, and that back to the title of our session called Wages and Productivity, is you all are looking at new ways or new reasons why, whether it be geography, whether it be education and skills, whether it be because your nativity status or immigration status, that there are these gaps between compensation or between wages and people's productivity. So, any comments, questions?
Well,
Yeah,
thank you, Bill. Well, I do agree with these characteristics that could be interesting to get. But for example, well, we control for the age of workers. For your first comment, we control for the age of workers, but that's just a proxy of their level and the time when they enter the job market. But we do not have specific variables to enter into the data in order to take into account this kind of comments. But that could be really, really interesting. Well, for your next comment related to let's say the duration of over education, yeah, that could be interesting. That could be also really interesting, but we need more data, and we need to switch from cross-sectional to panel data in order to be able to follow workers, in order to say whether they remain over-educated or not. But we do not have this kind of data in this survey.
Well, on the age comment, all I was thinking that there you could do is just run your models, but use, let's say, 16 to 24-year-olders, right? Or if you have a 10-year proxy, right, and use it for, again, for younger people, right, with this notion that that young people, particularly more in a variety of European and even U.S. labor markets, kids who were, let's say, the humanities major in college, and now they have a college degree, but they can't get something, a position in there. So do you just see that it's kind of like doing what doing what Valentine did, right? So estimate the models separately for young people and see if the coefficient, see if that disadvantage is larger for young people than the overall sample.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I will check that. Thank you.
Yeah. Other thoughts, other comments? Are we ready for dinner? All right, going once. Going twice. Oh, yeah. And just seeing some friends who are putting stuff in the chat. But congratulations on 3 great papers. Let me thank the discussants for their great and thoughtful comments. And then I also want to thank Emily and Bernadette who keep LERA moving. Keep LERA moving. I had the opportunity to, it's my second time to be co-chair of the planning committee. And it's a large reason why I accepted the second time was because of their leadership, and also my new colleague, Abigail or Abby Wozniak, who's runs an institute at the Minneapolis Fed. She was really great to work with. And if this is your first time to present and be a part of LERA, hope you come back. It's a great organization. I found it probably my sort of number of years in the profession, roughly for many of you all, and hopefully we'll be back in person with each other next year at this time. There will be a new call for papers and presentations and sessions that'll go out. That I hope that you all will resubmit. So let me stop there. And as my Welsh friends like to say, are you happy enough? So, well, thank you. Happy New Year. Thank you. Take care. Peace.